Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Varela. I'm excited to welcome you all to our presentation today. I am the Director of Advocacy and Communication for the Urban League of Philadelphia. The Urban League of Philadelphia is a direct service nonprofit social organization that's been around for 104 plus years in the Philadelphia region. Focused primarily on economic empowerment for African American and other marginalized communities. Our work spans different facets to ensure that African Americans are entering into the middle class and beyond, whether helping someone buy a house, someone start a business, helping put their kids through college. The Urban League has been focused on power and parity for the community. We are excited to be involved with this event today. From the power perspective, when we think about voting and census, that's bedrock American responsibilities, liberties, and just ideals that are sometimes not always afforded to all communities. And that's one of the reasons why we're here today. We really want to understand this critical issue that impacts many of us in the Philadelphia region. When we think about power and how power is transferred from one community to the other, that's very critical, because when we think about the resources that the census provides, those are resources that are moving away from communities that so desperately need those resources. So it's important that we think about that in that framework, that when we think about the issues and we think about poverty and some of the things that we see in the Philadelphia region, this is one aspect where those resources are being removed, which is creating this vacuum for these issues to exist. So we're excited to be here to learn more and hopefully be able to share this far and wide with others as well. You're going to hear from several voices this evening that will be talking both from the data perspective and their lived experience on this issue, including Senator Sharif Street, a prime sponsor of a bill, a forthcoming bill that is focused on the specific issue of prison gerrymandering. At this time, I'm going to introduce Brianna Remster. She is an associate professor of sociology and criminology from Villanova University. Brianna, thank you for joining us this evening.
I'm a social scientist, and I study the consequences of mass incarceration and mass criminalization. And as Tomas said, I'm an associate professor at Villanova and a Philadelphia resident. In the next few minutes, I'm just going to kind of lay out what prison gerrymandering is, and then share some of my research on how prison gerrymandering is specifically affecting political representation here in Pennsylvania. But first, I'd like to acknowledge my talented co-author on this research, Dr. Rory Kramer. So in theory, every person is counted equally when drawing political district boundaries, including non-voters. So children, non-citizens, and incarcerated people can't vote, but are counted for apportioning political representation, because you don't have to be a voter to contact your representative with concerns or use the services that your legislator's office offers, right? So this is often referred to as the 1 person equals 1 vote rule. But the census counts, it currently counts, incarcerated people as residents of the political districts where they are physically incarcerated instead of their home districts. Most states and localities use census data when drawing their legislative boundaries. This practice is what's known as prison gerrymandering, and it politically advantages districts that have prisons. Right? And prisons, as many of you know, are generally located in rural or suburban districts that are predominantly white. Right? This means, in practical terms, that it's easier for people who live in a district with a prison to get their concerns heard by their legislator, because their district contains what we call phantom constituents. Right? Despite being counted as residents of those districts, their legislator does not consider incarcerated people to be their constituents, right? And incarcerated people's concerns often relate to their home community instead of the district where they're physically housed, right, inside prison. And in extreme cases of prison gerrymandering, having a prison in a district actually allows some districts to meet the legal definition of equal representation, only because of they have a prison full of phantom constituents. So the census, however, this policy of how prisoners are currently counted does not just advantage rural districts, which is probably the most popular aspect when people talk about prison gerrymandering. We're here tonight as residents of Southeastern Pennsylvania, and it's really important to understand that while it's advantaging rural districts, it's simultaneously hurting urban communities. Right? Those votes are, those people, those bodies are coming from somewhere. And so districts where incarcerated people are drawn from are losing their representation to rural districts. Right? So residents of districts with high incarceration are politically silenced because it's harder for those residents to get their concerns heard by their legislator, right? Because that legislator, despite their best of efforts, is incredibly overworked. Right? On top of their own constituents, legislators representing districts with the high incarceration rate are also fielding requests from those incarcerated folks who are, for example, contacting them with concerns about their children's schools. So those legislators are doing double duty, right? And importantly, prison gerrymandering punishes every single resident of districts with high incarceration rates. Right? So regardless of whether a resident has ever had any contact with the criminal justice system, residents of those districts have less representation. Right? So, nutshell, prison gerrymandering creates unequal political representation. Right? And why is this so important? Because without equal representation, we don't have a functioning democracy. Right? If some people's votes or voices are counting more, that's no longer a democracy, right? So the good news, though, is that, as many of you might know, 10 states so far have already ended prison gerrymandering by just counting incarcerated people in their home communities instead of where they're imprisoned, right? And adjusting their political district boundaries to ensure equal representation. It's not that difficult to do. It just requires some extra work on the part of states. Right? But some have already successfully done it and have implemented a districting that counts people in the communities that they are meaningful members of. Right? And so while redistricting can occur at any time, when there's an issue, automatically, and that's part of why we're here tonight, redistricting occurs automatically every 10 years after a new census is taken. Right? And that's because population change happens over time. And so we have to constantly update our districts in an attempt to ensure equal representation. Right? So what's happening in Pennsylvania? My colleague, Dr. Kramer, as I mentioned, we've been studying together how prison gerrymandering is affecting life here in Pennsylvania, right? As residents and as a state that is using the census data and counting people where they're incarcerated to apportion political districts. So specifically, we wanted to know how much political representation would differ for Pennsylvania House districts, is what we're focusing on tonight, if incarcerated people were counted in their home communities instead of where they're physically incarcerated. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into details about how we estimated the impact. I'm happy to send you the full paper or talk more about it. But it's pretty simple. Honestly, we removed the people from the districts, removed incarcerated people from the districts where they were physically incarcerated from those district counts. And then we returned them to their home communities, right? And doing so allows us to see whether representation would need to shift in Pennsylvania House districts when incarcerated people are counted in their home communities, like 10 states are already in the process or have done so across the country, right? And so we can, be able to directly assess whether we have any districts that are violating this equal representation principle, which in Pennsylvania is defined by state law as, so when we're looking at House districts, there are 203, and it's very simple. They just take, another reason why we need the census data, it takes the total state population after every new census, divides it by 203, and then every district to achieve equal representation has to be within plus or minus 5% of that number, right? So it's a very clear-cut criteria. Otherwise, yeah, if a district is over or under that 5%, then people are unconstitutional, right? Not getting equal representation. So let's turn to look at some of our findings. So in total, we find that 34 districts out of that 203 lose or gain more than 837 residents if incarcerated people are counted in their home communities instead of where they're incarcerated. So for the statisticians in attendance, that's a gain or loss of more than 1 standard deviation. Yeah, it's close to 1,000 people is a lot of change in, by the way, so we're looking at, this is every 10 years. The most recent data, we still don't have the 2020 data, is 2010, right? And the average district was in the low 60,000s, right? So gaining or losing almost 1,000 people. The districts in gray on the map are the ones that are losing the most residents in our scenario. As you can see, those are mostly rural districts located in central and western Pennsylvania. In contrast, the Black districts on the map are districts which gain more than 837 people. And those districts are located in urban areas like Pittsburgh and Eastern Pennsylvania, including places like Allentown, Reading, and of course, here we are in southeastern PA. So if we can zoom in a little bit for a moment on southeastern Pennsylvania, District 150 is the gray district in the upper left. And that's one of the districts that lost a lot of population after we removed and returned incarcerated people. As many of you know, District 150 is largely white and largely suburban, but partly rural too, right? And it contains State Correctional Institute Phoenix, formerly known as Graterford, as well as Montgomery County's jail. Right. In fact, District 150 loses the most residents of all 203 Pennsylvania House districts, over 5,000 total people, because it contains both a prison and a jail. Right. The nearby Black shaded district that's contains Norristown, which is, again, we know this, but predominantly Latinx and Black community. And then, not surprisingly, 3 districts in Philly are shaded Black. Each of them contain, are in that category of containing the most new population once we count people in their home communities. And it's hard to see there because 2 of the districts are actually contiguous, right? And not surprisingly, these districts that are that gain so many new residents are located in the heart of Philly's Black neighborhoods, right? So overall, what we're seeing is that prison gerrymandering is shifting political power away from urban areas to rural areas without adding a single voter to the district, right? Because incarcerated people can't vote in Pennsylvania. So you might be wondering, are there any of these districts that we're talking about, though, that are actually legally too small or legally too big to be a district where we would need to adjust our boundaries and redistrict to ensure equal representation? And the answer is yes. So for Pennsylvania as a whole, we find that after we, in our scenario where we count incarcerated people in their home communities, 4 districts would be, and I should note, these are very conservative estimates. And again, I can talk more about that if folks are interested, but at least 4 districts are legally too small to qualify under, as districts under Pennsylvania's state definition of equal representation, right? And so, they're mostly rural districts, those 4, that would have to be revamped to be compliant with equal representation. And one of those 4, though, is District 150 that we were just looking at, that, has the most, that loses the most population, 5,000 people, because of SCI Phoenix and Montgomery County Jail. On the other side, we also find 4 districts that are legally too large. Again, at least 4, because our estimates are conservative. If people were incarcerated in their home communities, 4 districts would be too big, right? All 4 of those districts are urban or include a central city and in a rural county. So together, those 4 districts add up to contain about 264,000 Pennsylvania residents, meaning that 264,000 Pennsylvania residents are underrepresented, right? They're not getting 1 person equals 1 vote. They're not getting equal representation, right? And because of who's incarcerated, right? Black and brown people being disproportionately incarcerated, those people are then, of course, disproportionately impacted by prison gerrymandering, right? So we also find that, sorry, my notes here, over 100,000 Black Philadelphia residents alone, right? Because they live in those 3 districts we were looking at a moment ago, don't have representational equality, right? That's roughly 20% of Philadelphia's Black population. Right? And perhaps, you know, even more striking is that 3 of the 4 districts that grow too large in our scenario are majority minority districts. So if incarcerated people were counted as living in their home community, if Pennsylvania ended prison gerrymandering, there's a substantial likelihood that an additional majority minority district in Philadelphia would be needed to satisfy the Voting Rights Act requirements. Okay? What does this mean in practical terms? It means, you know, if this you know, scenario was carried through and you know, there was an additional legislator from Philadelphia that's representing a majority minority district, it means that basically, you know, is it going to shift dramatically the political landscape of, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, of what the state legislature representation looks like? No, but it means having an additional 1 to 2 people, you know, at least in the state legislature that are representing communities of color, right? That are, and those concerns are not, you know, common. Having additional people advocating for those concerns, which differ from many of the other districts represented in the state legislature, is a big deal, right? Is meaningful, and it's also, you know, what equal representation and the Voting Rights Act are in place for, right? So having, you know, 2 more advocates advocating for communities of color. Lastly, is thinking about, you know, so we see this huge impact on Black residents in Philadelphia, but what about, you know, the rest of the state? We wanted to calculate average effects for all residents of Pennsylvania by race. And so we did this just to see, you know, if you know, for people who live outside of Philadelphia, for instance, how's the average white Pennsylvania resident impacted by prison gerrymandering versus the average Pennsylvania Black resident versus the average Pennsylvania Latinx resident. And so what we find in our scenario, where people are again counted as residents of the communities where they're from instead of where they're held, is that the average white Pennsylvania resident would lose roughly 59 people from their district, right, if we ended prison gerrymandering. And in contrast, the average Black person's district would gain 353 new residents. Right? And again, remember, districts are on average in roughly 60,000 people. Right? Similarly, the average Latinx person would gain also about 313 new residents. So in short, we see that Black and Latinx votes are being diluted in comparison to white votes, right, in Pennsylvania, because Black and Latinx people are less likely to live in districts in which incarcerated persons are inflating the number of non-voting residents compared to whites, right? So on average, just across the board, white Pennsylvania residents' votes are mattering more than Black and Latinx Pennsylvania votes. So in closing, and you know, this is a very intentional policy decision, right, that results in the underrepresentation of people of color in Pennsylvania, and you know, at the expense, white voters are, in contrast, their votes are amplified, right? While people of color are silenced. But again, here I am noting on ending on a positive note here that many states and localities across the country have changed their policy and recently, and in fact, 6 of the 10 states that have ended prison gerrymandering so far did so just in the past 2 years. So with this kind of momentum, the effects of prison gerrymandering on representation, for people of color that we just saw, it's now the time for Pennsylvania to end prison gerrymandering too. Thank you so much for listening. Please get in touch if you have questions. I'll put my contact information and the link to the full paper if you want to read more about the details in the chat. But to continue learning about the impact of prison gerrymandering tonight, it is my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Saleem Holbrook. Robert Saleem Holbrook is the Executive Director of the Abolitionist Law Center.
Thank you, Brianna. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I'm going to share out a little bit of my personal experiences about prison gerrymandering, and I'm going to talk about it from what we like to call the view from inside, and that is the view from behind the bars, behind the prison gun towers, and behind the barbed wire. I'm someone who today I am the Executive Director of the Abolitionist Law Center. I'm a native of Philadelphia. I grew up in the Fairmount Spring Garden section of Philadelphia, and I've always had a lifelong attachment to the city and proud to be a part of the city, but I'm also someone who served 27 years in prison for an offense that I was involved in as a juvenile in the city of Philadelphia during the late 80s. Myself, like many other young teenagers, like many of the kids today, was caught up in the drug game and was caught up in the culture that was just destroying our communities. And on the night of my 16th birthday, I was a 16-year-old lookout to a drug-related homicide and served 27 years in prison. The state tried to kill me at the age of 16. That was under the reign of America's deadliest DA, Lynn Abraham. So a lot of what we're dealing with today in Philadelphia resonates with me based on those experiences back then, when we see the spike in the violence in the city, where we see people who are calling for, certain people who are calling for a return of the days of Philadelphia's office to be the office of America's deadliest DA. As if that will have any impact on what's going on in our streets. And so when I first learned about prison gerrymandering, I was one of those people on the inside. It was in the late 90s. I was at SCI Huntington, which is in central Pennsylvania, and the majority of prisoners from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and the urban areas of Pennsylvania, Allentown, Erie, Harrisburg, Chester, we all found ourselves hundreds of miles away from home in these very rural areas, very conservative areas, very white areas. And basically prisons, for the most part, were a generational legacy for many of the communities for many of the families in these communities. And at SCI Huntington, the prison staff, I would say, was 5% minority and 95% white, whereas though the prison population was 70% Black and Latinx. And so we felt under siege up there. It felt like a cultural war in that prison, but not just that prison. When I was at SCI Dallas, which is up in northeastern Pennsylvania, it was the same way. When I was at SCI Albion, all the way in northwest Pennsylvania, it was the same way. When I was at SCI Green in southwestern Pennsylvania, it was the same way. The common theme was you had Black and brown bodies from urban areas who constituted the majority of prisoners in these prisons, and the prison administration and the surrounding communities were on average 85% white. So in the 90s, there were a group of prisoners in the prison I was at, and I was a younger prisoner, but I stayed in the law library. It was a group of prisoners who were fighting to get their voting rights back. Some of these prisoners were home and some of these prisoners were on the inside. But in fighting to get their voting rights back, they also learned about prison gerrymandering. And we started talking about prison gerrymandering. What resonated for us more than anything was that when we read about prison gerrymandering and learned that the state was counting us, Black and brown prisoners from Philadelphia and urban areas, as residents of these communities in these rural areas, in these very communities where every day that you woke up, the administration and the people let you know that you're not from this community. Many of them had a saying that they felt as though they should just carve Philadelphia off the map of Pennsylvania. And the reason for it, because they used all of the stereotypes that were associated with a city that has a majority Black and brown population, right? Same thing with Pittsburgh. Though Pittsburgh does not have a majority Black brown population, a lot of Black people come out of Pittsburgh. So the stereotypes surrounding Black people and brown people from these urban areas, every day we were reminded that you're not from up in these parts, you know? And that reminder was in the form of repression. That reminder was in the form of stripping you of your dignity, your humanity. And for us, our imprisonment was having our freedom taken away from us. But being disenfranchised, we did not feel was right. So when we read about prison gerrymandering, we connected it automatically with the historical disenfranchisement of the African-American community. We connected it with the way our ancestors, the way the fighters who fought for civil rights, the way they were fighting to end African-American disenfranchisement in the South at the voting box, but also for their representation. Let's not remember that Reconstruction was about rolling back Black political power, Black representation in the South, right? And so for us, when we learned about prison gerrymandering, that's what we connected it with. And we felt enraged by it, because having our freedom taken was one thing, but having our communities disenfranchised was another. Because we knew that we were not we're not residents of these communities. As I said, the legislatures, the politicians up there, if our family members would call up there to complain about prison abuse, to complain about being disrespected when they came and seen us, to complain even not just about the prison, but on their way up to the prison, to complain about being pulled over by state troopers or the treatment that they received in the town, stopping at a gas station at a stop and go or something like that. They were reminded very quickly that you're not from these parts, right? Why are you calling us about these people in our prisons? That's how the terminology they use. These people in our prisons, right? So it wasn't about, they had no connection with the people. They had their connection was with the prison, because the prison for a lot of these communities sustained them, right? It's no longer that way, because prisons have been found not to be a cash cow for these communities. But for many within these communities, these were generational jobs, generational wealth. They were all some of these communities had, these small towns. And so when our family members would call up there, every day we were reminded, they're not our constituents. And you who are calling, why are you calling? You're not our constituent. So when our family members then would have to call legislators from our neighborhoods in Philadelphia, or if you were from Pittsburgh, they would have to then call the prison, right? And ask, why are you mistreating prisoners up there? Or what's going on up there? And the first thing the prison would tell them is, why are you calling up here about this? You're from Philadelphia. So it was very frustrating for us because at every turn, we were reminded that you are not from these communities. Every turn, our family members were reminded of that. Like your people up here, they're not our people. But yet we were being counted as residents of these communities. So that created a real rage in a lot of us. And then to learn how the very communities, the very people who were who hated many of us, or who just had a set of values that were diametrically opposed to the values that we came up with, right? Of treating all people with humanity, with dignity, and respecting and fighting for people's rights. To know that these communities, or people or elements within these communities, were benefiting politically from this through political representation in the state legislature, that also really cut home deeply, because the very legislators from these communities that were supporting mass incarceration, who were opposed to any type of criminal justice reform, they were being empowered by our imprisonment in these camps and us being counted in these communities. So that was very frustrating to us. And that is something that we wanted to roll back. That is something we wanted to stop. And prisoners filed a lawsuit pro se by themselves in an attempt to stop it. Unfortunately, they were not able to. They attempted to get their voting rights back. They would succeeded in winning the voting rights back for people on parole, but not for people on the inside. And I feel like that's a fight that's also connected to prison gerrymandering, because it's part of historical disenfranchisement. But our fight to end prison gerrymandering did not go away. You have many people throughout the years who have been fighting for it. When I came home several years ago, I was approached by members of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they learned about advocacy in Pennsylvania. I became a plaintiff in the lawsuit that the NAACP filed to end prison gerrymandering based on my incarceration. And I've been home for 3 years, but I was counted in the census at SCI Green in 2010. So up until 2020, despite coming home in 2018, for 3 years, from 2018 to 2021, I was counted as a resident of SCI Green. The thing is that thousands of other prisoners, tens of thousands of prisoners, have experienced it. Prisoners who have been home for 8, 7, 6 years, 9 years are still being counted as residents of some of them prisons and around the state, these rural prisons. Now, some people will say, well, I mean, if you went to college at Penn State and stayed up there and graduated and left and got counted there, then well, you're still being counted. So what's the difference? The difference is people in prison are a captive population. That is the difference. And they are a population that has been taken from their communities and housed, incarcerated in communities away from their home. Now, their punishment is their freedom taken away from them. Their communities should not be punished, though. Their communities should not be disenfranchised for that. So that's why we're fighting to end prison gerrymandering, because for us, this is an issue that is connected to the historical disenfranchisement, the historical disembowelment of Black political power in this country. But not just Black political power, but marginalized and oppressed communities and people in this country. And that's why this is a fight that I'm proud to be a part of. However, prison gerrymandering also impacts a lot of these rural areas. And I'm going to bring on one of my colleagues, Jenna Henry from Free the Ballot, who can give us another picture of prison gerrymandering, a view from that side, to show how that it's also impacting many of these rural areas negatively. So Jenna, I'm going to introduce you, Jenna Presley from Free the Ballot.
Hello, I'm Jenna. Like Saleem said, I'm a statewide organizer with Free the Ballot. So whenever we started talking about this issue and talking about how do we get this changed in Pennsylvania, because the thing is, in Pennsylvania, all the power in the legislature is not in the Southeast. It's in what we call the T. It's the top and the middle of the state. That's where all the power in the legislature is. And, so if we want to move things, we have to kind of message it in a way that it makes sense to Republicans. And so it's actually interesting. So one of the things that I found is actually Brianna's study. And I found this map that was in a Philadelphia Inquirer article. And I believe it's the same map that Brianna showed earlier. What I find interesting when I look at this, though, is that you see that there is this green. The green is districts that would gain people from ending prison gerrymandering. So you see here, there are some rural districts that are losing people to this practice as well, because it's not necessarily just that rural Pennsylvania is automatically benefiting. It's the areas of rural Pennsylvania that have prisons that are benefiting, which is only about 12 counties in the entire state out of 67. So it's not as simple as just rural Pennsylvania benefits. They're actually disadvantaged. Like if you see right here, this is Warren County. You see Kathy Rapp, Republican Kathy Rapp, is actually losing 3% of her district's population to prison gerrymandering. So like I said, part of the reason for that is that, it's anywhere that doesn't have a prison is negatively impacted by this practice, because every county that doesn't have a prison is then sending people to prison in the 12 counties that do. And two, just because a place has a prison doesn't necessarily mean that having a prison there is benefiting them in every way. I talked to a county commissioner who said that having prisons is a strain on the public defender's office, because the state doesn't fund public defenders. It's all county tax dollars. And there's quite a bit of, new crime committed in prison, but it's not even always that. Like I know somebody who got a new crime in prison for assaulting a guard, but the guard was the one who assaulted him. So it's like, it's not even necessarily that the people within the prisons are just automatically committing new crime, but anytime that there's the police contact, the public defender's office has to represent those people. And I talked to a county controller who told me that they have trouble getting other businesses in that area where the prisons are, because these businesses don't want to, put their business next to a prison. And they had somebody do a flyover of the area and then pull out of a contract for, a large business that would have brought in hundreds of jobs. And on top of that, that business would have been paying property taxes and sewage and all these other things that would benefit the county, that the prisons currently do not have to pay because they're run by the state. So not only is not all, it's not just that rural Pennsylvania automatically benefits, it's only certain areas that are benefiting, and those areas are losing out in other ways. But one thing that we're seeing a trend of is like really tough on crime prosecutors in rural Pennsylvania. So these judges and these DAs, they really feel like they have to be super tough on crime. They have to hand out long sentences. Like I live in Center County. I know somebody who was sentenced to 75 to 150 years for selling drugs. And that's not a super uncommon thing to happen in these rural areas. So these rural areas are starting to send more and more people to prison. And you see it in the DOC, the PA DOC has an end of year report. And so the end of year report for 2019, the counties with the highest incarceration rates, So this is the percentage of their population that they're sending to prison. The highest in the entire state is Jefferson County at 964 per 100K. For reference, Philadelphia is number 2 at 716.7 per 100K. Number 3 is Venango County, which is super rural. That's at 698 per 100K. And then you have, one of the counties that, we just saw on the map here, Warren County is number 6 at 586.9 per 100K. So even though Philadelphia is sending more people overall, these rural counties are right on par with the per capita numbers that they're sending to prison. So, we're really starting to see an increase in rural incarceration rates. Another thing is that voters overwhelmingly support ending prison gerrymandering. And there was a study done from Quinnipiac University. They did a poll of upstate New York, rural upstate New York conservative voters, and 60% said that prisoners should be counted in their home and not where they're incarcerated. Only 25% said that they thought that those people should be counted in prison. So, when we're trying to talk to Republican legislators about this, this is something that people want. And people overwhelmingly agree with. The last point is just the sheer inaccuracy of counting incarcerated people in prisons in super rural, remote areas. And you see it the most in Forest County, Pennsylvania. So Forest and Elk County are right next to each other. They're extremely similar, similar demographics of the people that live there. According to the census, Elk County's demographics are 97.9% white, 0.5% Black, and 0.9% Latinx. Just one county over in Forest, you have 77.4% white, 21.1% Black, and 6.8% Latinx. The only difference in these counties is that one has a prison. And so when you're counting incarcerated people in prison in rural areas, it just doesn't make sense. It's just entirely inaccurate. The census is supposed to be a snapshot of what an area looks like, what an area needs. And when we're counting people who are incarcerated, where they're incarcerated, it's just not accurate. So next up, we're going to hear from John Rowland, who's going to talk a little bit about just the history of mass incarceration. And John is an organizer with the Abolitionist Law Center.
Thanks, Jenna. And thanks everyone for being here. I've heard this stat before when Jenna talked about it, but just hearing that 20% of the population of this entire county of Forest County is just the Black population of one prison, right? So just mind blowing to think about that. So what I'm going to do is just talk briefly here about some connections between prison gerrymandering and mass incarceration. So for folks that don't know anything about mass incarceration, I'll do a little bit of that, but what I'm really going to try to do is just build a couple of slightly less obvious connections between the two things, and show how they're really kind of propping each other up and mutually reinforcing one another. And just at the start of this, to set it off, so the Abolitionist Law Center works on a variety of different campaigns. And I'm going to touch on a few of the ones that we specifically work on within this presentation. And that's solitary confinement and aging people in prisons. So folks who are over the age of 50, 55 inside prisons, and solitary. And you might think that solitary especially doesn't have a whole lot to do with prison gerrymandering. But hey, that's my little grapevine for you here. You'll have to listen till the end of it. Quiz will be afterwards. But I mean, the campaigns that we run are always done in conjunction with folks who are inside prison. Saleem, who spoke before, is our executive director. And this is something that beyond just the kind of political impacts, it really is something that I think indexes and points to just a lot of the larger frustrations that Saleem was talking about, and just, a kind of used to be a teacher, still a teacher, as we'll see here. Yeah, but a lot of the sort of general feelings of disempowerment that a lot of folks inside feel. And that's really a core part of prison gerrymandering, as I'm going to explain. So I'm going to screen share here and walk you through this. The presentation is more detailed than I have time for, so forgive me, I'm just going to slip through a few slides quickly. So yeah, the point here again is a little bit of mass incarceration, but really to try to show how prison gerrymandering kind of exists because of mass incarceration, or at least it's not going away because of mass incarceration. And mass incarceration also is harder to roll back because of prison gerrymandering. So just for folks that don't know what we mean when we say mass incarceration, that graph on the right side of the screen is the best visual you can find for it. Because of a series of policy decisions made in the 1960s and 70s, primarily because of pushback to increasing Black and brown populations in urban cities in the North, the prison population blew up from about 200,000 people. Also, the numbers on the left are in thousands of people, so add another 0 to those. So it grew from around 200,000 people to about 2 million and change people. And this is not just a massive growth, but it's something that no other country did at the time, right? This was a purely American phenomenon, something purely designed by a series of policy decisions that, sort of started off in some states and started off at the federal level, but then sort of spread around the whole country, to the extent that you basically have every state throughout the country being governed by the policies that started and continue to prop up mass incarceration. So Pennsylvania within this thing, you can kind of see the same numbers. Important thing to point out about that graph you're seeing is that that is not the pure numbers, right? Because population increases usually over time. Pennsylvania's population hasn't increased by that much, but this is purely the rate of incarceration, right? So this is the amount of people per capita that are going in. So as the text on the left there says, Pennsylvania isn't the worst overall. Some of the states that you might expect to be worse, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas is famously bad, are worse. But some of the other states not too far from us that weren't as thoroughly controlled by mass incarceration, tough on crime thinking, have 3 times fewer folks than we do per capita inside prisons and jails. So I think the really important point to put out there is this was a sort of massive and shameful series of policy decisions, right? This was something that was intentionally done. There wasn't any sort of large population explosion or anything else. This is purely because the government decided that they were going to start locking up people, locking up many more people than they did before, keeping them for a lot longer than they did before, and keeping them in the larger system once they were outside of those things. I'm going to skip over this one. I think we'll be sending out this PowerPoint afterwards. I really like these ideas. I think they're really important for actually understanding how mass incarceration became so deep. But the one thing I'm going to leave there for now is to not think of mass incarceration probably as something that sort of evil people impose from above. I'm guessing that a lot of folks who are on this call tonight at this meeting actually harbor a lot of the ideas. And so a lot of the assumptions that are laying behind mass incarceration. So I'm not going to dwell on that for now, but I think it's really important to think about whenever we're thinking about mass incarceration or mass imprisonment, to think about it as really sort of the way that a few negative or judgmental principles came to be the only thing that governs, right? So it's important that we take those ideas out of the picture and think about sort of holistic social responses to violence, social responses to poverty, et cetera. And it's not a thing that's as easy as just saying, well, if we're a little bit less racist or if we're a little bit nicer to poor people, mass incarceration will go away. We really have to structure the entire sort of philosophical response that we have to it. So the first sort of point about mass incarceration and prison gerrymandering I want to bring up is that Pennsylvania resisted for a while at the start of the mass incarceration era, massively expanding their prisons, but the policies led them to just have too many people. So they only had the start of the mass incarceration era, 6 state prisons in the 1970s, and that grows and grows and grows and really sort of explodes in the early 90s. And right now, there's the 24 prisons. It was 26 a few years ago. They've closed down a few of the older facilities in the last 2 years. But it grew, by 20 prisons during this time period. So obviously that means that a lot more legislators are in on prison gerrymandering, right? You only had 6 prisons, you only have 6 senators, 6 House reps who are in on this. But since you now have 24 state prisons, as you can see in the map, they're spread out throughout the entire state, a little bit here, a little bit there. Primarily in rural communities, but there's a few that are, in general urban areas. There's a lot more legislators who now benefit directly from prison gerrymandering, which means, of course, in large terms, it's harder for them to go against their self-interest and want to roll back prison gerrymandering. Also, just a quick note, can't go by without this. The last prison that was built was opened in 2019. SCI Phoenix, the cost just to build that thing was about $500 million, right? So these are astronomical costs that we're talking about for mass incarceration. I'm going to go through this slide really quickly. So placing the prisons in these smaller areas and putting them throughout the state means that more people are involved, more people have their hands inside of prison gerrymandering and want to keep it involved, keep it propped up. But there's also some sort of subtle ties that prop up both mass incarceration and prison gerrymandering that happen once you do have a prison in your district. And a few of those there at the bottom are that you're going to be working a lot more with the Correctional Officers Union, who are usually in league with the Fraternal Order of Police. There's usually some sort of relationships there. You're also going to be generally sort of networking more with district attorneys' offices throughout the state. And if anybody that's done any kind of Harrisburg-related work or any kind of lobbying to try to support bills knows the District Attorneys Association and the kind of district attorneys as a whole are the single sort of most important roadblock, the worst sort of pushback to mass incarceration reforms. So those are a few important things. Just by having a prison in your district, you're going to be it's more in your interest to be pro mass incarceration. To bring in one of our other campaigns that we at the Abolitionist Law Center work on, aging people in prison are a huge sort of effect of mass incarceration. The policies that I was mentioning before that led to mass incarceration, in addition to creating a lot more crimes and creating a lot more reasons that people can go to prison, they also uniformly massively increase the sentences. And in a lot of instances, and we'll hear from a couple of people who are going to talk about direct experiences with those in a minute, that means going to prison when you're often a young person, often between the ages of 15 and 25, so by far the most common age of intake into prisons, and staying there for decades and decades and decades. So that means not just is there more people in prison, but there's the same people in prison for a very, very long time. So this obviously increases the raw amount of people that are prison gerrymandering, but I also think it's a really important thing to keep in mind that some of these folks are literally, some people who are in prison are prison gerrymandered for 6 decades at a time, right? 50, 60 years at a clip. And Joe Ligon is an example of that. Another one here, someone I used to work with, Clarence Sutton, who was prison gerrymandered for 5 different censuses before he just recently passed of COVID. Had no ability to get out of prison as a person serving life without parole, which is mandatory in Pennsylvania prisons for 1st or 2nd degree homicide. The final point I want to make about mass incarceration and the way that it's supported and continues to support prison gerrymandering is that once prisons became at this scale and at this magnitude, once they went from this handful of folks inside these 6 prisons to 25 prisons spread throughout the entire state, the entire model of what a prison did had to change, because prisons were suddenly way too expensive to start actually doing rehabilitation or to continue to support the sort of work training programs and the things that used to exist there. As this slide is saying, in Pennsylvania, the prison system is called the Department of Corrections, right? The name is an artifact from an earlier period. And as folks at the very start of mass incarceration were realizing, whoa, we have so many people now, that what we're actually doing is just warehousing people. So a couple quotes in that slide that I won't read off just for the sake of time. But this, wasn't a conspiracy theory. It wasn't something that was quiet. This was sort of every person who was around a prison realizing there's just too many people here. We can't manage this as a rehabilitation place. All we can do is kind of keep order and try to keep control as much as possible over it. So how does that affect prison gerrymandering? Well, it's pretty simple. Once you take away this corrections or rehabilitation model, you suddenly have a model where prisons are strictly about orders, right? The COs are fully in charge and they tell you what you can do and you can't do. And that means that they have to set up consequences and punishments for everything that happens immediately. And that means that you have things like solitary confinement, which is another issue we work on, another campaign we're working on at the Abolitionist Law Center. Solitary confinement did not exist in the state of Pennsylvania or pretty much any prison system in the US from about the year 1900 up until the mass incarceration era in the 1970s. And once the prison started being overcrowded in this way, they started to bring it back as a punishment that they could use to keep control, to maintain order. And John Thompson is going to talk about that in a second. But the reason why that's important for prison gerrymandering is you start to have actually a far, far greater need than before for folks to be able to have recourse to a higher power that can hear their complaints, that can hear the ways that they're being abused, that can hear the ways that prisons are not following policies, right? If there's a lot more COs cracking down on people, then there's a lot more need for people inside prison to reach out and say, hey, something bad is happening to me. I need someone in the government, someone who's above the prisons, or at least equal with them at the state level, to be able to have an ear for me, right? To look out. And that means the fact that they don't have direct representation, that there's no legislator that they can call or their family members can call and say, hey, something horrible has happened to my loved one at the prison. That means that with mass incarceration growth, you have a massive new growth in these number of folks, these number of problems that are happening inside the prison. So, the things that people do need representation for grew not just with the numbers, but also with the style or the type of prison that was here. So just to sum up, that's my last slide here. Since there's more prisons around the state and just more people in them, that obviously gives greater incentive to keep mass incarceration around. And that means folks also want to keep prison gerrymandering around. So it incentivizes having more power in these rural districts, and it also kind of incentivizes those rural districts to keep that prison there and to keep those policies in place. And that last point, which I was just explaining, more warehousing, more control means more hostility, more adversary relationships in the prison. And that means more help that folks inside need, that from political representatives, from folks who are in the Senate or the House. And they're, of course, not able to get that, right, since they don't actually have representation. So in just a second, I'm going to turn it over to a couple folks to make what I was talking about here a little less abstract and to show you how it plays out day to day. But I also just want to say, so at Abolitionist Law Center, one of the projects that we've been working on, especially since COVID started, is right now we have reasonably good support for a lot of the policies we're trying to push back against mass incarceration, to roll back some of its excesses, to get rid of the abuse of solitary confinement, to allow for the release of folks who are aging in prison to come home. And we're relatively strong in areas like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, right? But a lot of times it's in these other areas throughout the state. And not necessarily the super rural areas that Jenna was talking about, Venango County and Forest County, but even in places like Chester County, Westmoreland County, suburban areas, Erie County, which is half rural, half urban. Those are the places where legislators and other folks often don't talk about mass incarceration issues, often don't put them up to the front of the pack. So one of the major projects we've been working on, I want to invite everybody here to be part of, is what we're calling the Keystone Incarceration Block, which is for folks outside of the biggest cities in the state to fight against mass incarceration and to really start building together, learning from folks who have already done it, but also getting active in their own areas. So I'm going to drop a registration link inside the chat. And hopefully anybody who is from, you're obviously welcome if you are from Philadelphia, but especially from folks who are outside of that, we're doing a bunch of work now on solitary confinement and Asian people in prison. So we'd love to have you for that. So I'll drop it in the chat, but I'm gonna pass it over now to John Thompson, who's gonna talk about some of the things I was just setting up here. So thank you all.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Thompson. I'm an organizer for ALC, the Abolitionist Law Center. I'm a juvenile lifer. I served 37 years in 12 different state correctional institutions here in Pennsylvania. As you've heard, not only does prison gerrymandering take away resources, but to me, from my perspective, it's the representation that's taken away from those individuals. Our Constitution says that we ought to be represented in this democracy. However, when you're in prison, you are not represented. You don't have a representative. You don't have someone who you can write for to get things done, or if you're being abused, or if something's wrong, or you need some help with your family, or your family needs some help. You don't have anybody to write. When I was up SCI Green, I wrote Bill DeWeese. Bill DeWeese was the state rep up there back then. And I wrote him first, one time, wrote him again, 2 times, wrote him again. And I even wrote him a 4th time. Never received a response at all. Not even anything. Nothing came in the mail, never received a response. So another prisoner told me, why don't you write Shirley Kitchen, who's from Philadelphia, who was a state rep during that time from Philadelphia. I wrote Shirley Kitchen, and lo and behold, she called to the prison because I was being abused. They wasn't feeding me. They wasn't giving me showers. They wasn't giving me my yard. And we're not talking about for days. We're talking about for months. We're talking about, just passing my cell, when it's shower time, just passing my cell. So I was reaching out for representation for someone in authority from that district to help, to come in, to at least write a letter or make a phone call to inquire about it. No one ever did until I wrote Shirley Kitchen from Philadelphia. So as you can see, when people are in these prisons far out, they have no recourse. They do not have the ability to get someone to represent them from that district, because most of those state reps will just ignore you. And then the ones that don't ignore you, they'll give you a perfunctory answer. They're really not going to do anything. Prisoners, people in these prisons are, when they are abused, what can you do? Who do you turn to? And then you talk about, well, why do prisoners, why was he in the hole? Well, maybe he was in the hole for disobeying an order. But during his time in the hole, he was treated so badly and reaching out for help from state reps or from state representatives in that area or surrounding areas. No, you're not going to get any help. So with prison gerrymandering, you can clearly see that prisoners lose their representation, that they don't have any recourse. They don't have anybody who they can contact to say, I'm being abused, I haven't eaten in a week, or every time they give me my tray, it's some kind of something mixed in it, and they won't give me showers. I haven't been in the yard in 6 months because they won't let me out in the yard. Now, some people might sit here and say, I don't see this happening, but I can assure you that not only is it happening, it's happening right now today as we speak. Right now, while we're on here, I can assure you that there are prisoners around this state who are being abused, who will reach out for help, and they're not going to reach out to the local people because they're not going to get an answer. They're going to reach out to Philadelphia, Vincent Hughes, Sharif Street, names that they know. And then those officers will call up there and make an inquiry and say, what's going on with Mr. Thompson? I got a letter from Mr. Thompson saying so-and-so, so-and-so. Like Saleem said, they'll be like, nothing. Wow, who are you? You're from Philadelphia. This is our thing up here. We do, we do what we want. So when we talk about ending prison gerrymandering, that is something that cuts to the root of mass incarceration. That is part of mass incarceration, prison gerrymandering. So let's not forget that about the men and women in those prisons who suffer without any recourse. That's my main concern, that people are in there suffering and they don't have recourse. They don't have anybody. See, with me, I was able to do other things. But since I was a paralegal, I was able to write the courts and get some relief. That's how I got relief. I didn't get relief from Bill DeWeese. Shirley Kitchen helped me get some relief because she had her office kept calling up there. And it was irritating them because they even came to my cell and asked me, why do I have this state representative calling the prison? Of which I never answered because they don't care. Like Saleem said, they have their own thing, and it's a cultural difference. They see us as something else, not human beings, as some people that we have to keep locked in these cages. So they need to have representation even more so than people who are out here who can represent themselves, so to speak, because in there you can't represent yourself. The administration is not going to listen to you in any of those prisons. So the only way to make them stop the abuse and stop doing the things that they're doing is to have outside pressure coming from state senators and state representatives. And if you don't have that representation, what are you left with? If somebody can answer that question, I would love to hear it, because I spent about 14 years in solitary confinement. And I wrote not just Bill DeWeese, I must have wrote 10 other ones with a little small flex pen. I must have wrote about 15 of them all together. I got 2 or 3 answers that said, sorry, there's nothing we can do for you. You're not in our district, so forth and so on. And that was the end of it until Shirley Kitchen. And Saleem probably knows who I'm talking about when I talk about Shirley Kitchen, because she was a big advocate of helping people in prison, even though we were not listed in her district. But because we wrote her and we were from Philadelphia, she would give us an assistance that we needed, the assistance that we could not get from the districts in that prison, where that prison is located at. So I'm gonna keep this short, because I could go on and on about this all day. Like, we could be literally sitting here until 10 o'clock tonight, because I feel so strongly about this issue, about this prison gerrymandering issue, because I personally know how it feels. And I personally know how it's affecting prisoners every day on the inside. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Dee Dee, Mama Dee Dee. Yes.
Everything that should have been said has been said. So I can only speak on as a mother side of things. Like John Thompson said, it's mind-blowing how my son's been incarcerated 27 years, and he's not considered a constituent in that district he's in, yet he's a resident. And exactly how JT said that none of those people, my son can possibly be sitting next to them. They wouldn't know who he is, because they really don't care about who he is. They just know that they're getting their money, and he's counted in their district for the betterment of them, not him. And I'm against gerrymandering, prison gerrymandering, because I didn't go to Huntington, Pennsylvania to have my son. I had him here in Philadelphia. He was born and raised here in Philadelphia. So why would they take away not only from my family or from my son, but from our communities, and be counted in somewhere where they couldn't care less if a bus came and hit him and ran him over? So I'm definitely against all of this. And I know what JT says when he says that there's no help from those people down there, because there isn't. The only way I got help for my son is through Cabby, speaking to legislator here, State Senator Nikhil Sabal, Sharif Street, Malcolm Kenyatta. You know, it's all these representatives from down here that are backing up on my son and are fighting for him, even though they don't know him, but because he belongs here in Philadelphia and he's their constituents, then they're going for him. And it's mind-boggling of why people don't seem to understand this. I can't talk like everybody because I'm not into all these things. I just know that my son is not counted as a human being where he's at, yet he's good enough to be counted as a resident so that they can make money off of him. And then not only off of him, but then off of us, his family, instead of him being counted here in Philadelphia, where he needs and should be counted. So people do research. I don't do research because I'm not too hip to technology, but I just know that I didn't go to Huntington, Pennsylvania to have my son out there. So that money shouldn't be going to nobody down there, especially if they're not helping them. So we need to stop this prison gerrymandering and get back to treating people as what they are, people. Thank you for having me here.
Dee Dee, thank you for sharing your heart. And thank you, John Thomas, for sharing your heart. And thank you for all who have shared so much of your experience. Saleem, John, Jenna, you all have really strong experience of this, and it's been really moving to hear many of your stories. We're really honored to hear now from Senator Sharif Street. I'm Carol Kuniholm, by the way. I'm chair of Fair Districts PA. We're concerned about all kinds of gerrymandering, but we've been focusing on prison gerrymandering because it does impact so many communities in such an extreme way. And we want people to understand that as new maps are being drawn, we want to make sure the maps are drawn in a way that communities are well represented. So I believe Senator Sharif Street has been mentioned 3 times tonight, and fortunately he's here with us. He is the prime sponsor of a bill to address this, and he is going to speak a little bit about the reason for him being so concerned about this and some of his own experience. Senator Street, thank you for joining us.
Look, I want to thank everybody for continuing to fight. It is fun. It's fundamentally important. Brother John Thompson took me back talking about Senator Kitchen and the work she was doing. I was a staffer for Senator Kitchen before I was a senator. And yes, we took the calls and went to the prisons to deal with the issues that were facing incarcerated individuals back then. And as a senator, I've done the same thing myself. It is unconscionable that communities that are completely unconcerned with the living conditions of inmates want to claim them for purposes of legal representation in the General Assembly, in the House and Senate, and even in Congress, but don't want to. It's exactly right. Those representatives will have no interest in advocating for positions that better the lives of people in prison. As a matter of fact, many of the folks, as was really done in a really well done. Laid out the real cause that many of the legislators who represent the physical facilities for prisons are the main ones who are fighting against the rights of inmates. They're fighting against policies that allow people to come home. They're fighting for increased mass incarceration. And those legislators, in many cases, wouldn't even have their districts if it wasn't for, or would have smaller, they wouldn't have as many districts in those areas if it wasn't for all of the people who are incarcerated. And they not only get voting representation, they get additional money for block grants, community development block grants, for job creation and everything else. And quite simply, those folks, like Ms. Dee Dee said, weren't born there, didn't choose to live there, and are simply being held there against their will by the government. And they should be counted where they are from, where they will return, and where legislators where their families are, and where people will actually care about them. And that makes so much more sense. And it is true. We're going to fight for. I will continue to fight for folks who are incarcerated, even if they're not going to be incarcerated in my district because there are no state correctional facilities in my district. But I know they're coming home there, and that's where their families are, and we care about them. And so that's important. So yes, I've introduced legislation that would end the current practices of prison gerrymandering. It is not likely to move in the composition of this General Assembly. That being said, we have to raise the issue up. We have to call out the inequities because we need to put a marker in the ground. And additionally, we need, in the places where we can win the fight, we need to continue to advance policies at the district attorney level, at the judge level, to make sure that we are doing whatever we can to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated, to reverse mass incarceration. We need to start talking about the social determinants of crime, the social determinants of crime. For instance, we know that if you, as poverty increases, as drug addiction increases, and as the availability of firearms increases, you're going to be more likely to have violent crime, more likely to have murders, more likely to have shootings. Is the lack of availability for mental health training increases, as the increase in all the conditions that lead to physical and psychological abuse, sexual and psychological abuse occur. All those things are positively correlated with crime. So the slide that sort of said the myths around it are so important, because we now are having people, again, because where crime is upticking, and we know it's going up because of, murders are going up because of the pandemic, because of the mitigations, because of the isolation that people are feeling, because of the lack of economic opportunities. But we are hearing now, even in places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, we're hearing people start talking about, you know what, we need to get tougher on crime. We need to lock more people up. We need to put more penalties in place. And they're doing that because subconsciously they've already bought into the philosophical framework that gives rise to mass incarceration. The idea that if you just lock up one more person, the idea that you're going to make everyone safer. But we know that if you continue to have conditions where we underfund education, we reduce the opportunity, we increase the presence of guns and drugs, that people won't be safer. And if you can continue to lock more and more people up, and all you're going to have is more broken communities and less people and more people incarcerated. And so we need to understand that if we do the things like investing in education, we do the things like putting in intervention programs, putting in some social services programs, that we can reduce and eliminate some of the things which give rise to the conditions that allow for crime to happen. And so we call those social determinants. So what we need to do is say, you know what, crime is going up. What kinds of things can we put in place to reduce the social, to eliminate social determinants of crime? What kinds of things can we do to mitigate against the systemic things that are causing for this rise in crime? What's going on around the whole country and around all these different cities that have this spiking in crime, as most cities do? And if we start addressing the root causes, we find that, you know what, the root cause is not that there aren't enough people incarcerated. I ask people this question: the United States has per capita by far the most people incarcerated, but we are not by far the safest country in the world. And if you think about that sort of simple thing, how do other countries that have a lot less people incarcerated, how do they make themselves safer? It's because they're dealing with these root causes of crime. And some people will say, well, how does that tie into prison gerrymandering? Well, it ties into it because the ability of people to elect people who won't advance mass incarceration, won't advance policies that give rise to mass incarceration, is directly tied to people being enfranchised and having the ability to vote. And so it is important that we allow people equal representation and voting rights, because when we defend that, we defend the ability to reverse some of these problems. Whenever we're talking about making changes in state law, you'll always hear people talking about we need 102 votes in the House, 26 in the Senate, and a governor. All of those people are elected. And so anything that reduces the ability of communities and people who care about ending mass incarceration from being enfranchised and voting, in fact, is a part of the problem. And so we really do need to understand what's going on and how we reverse it. The other thing, we need to address these economic incentives. You know, when I first got to the Senate, I attended some hearings and about prison, about the governor proposing to close SCI Pittsburgh. And the only thing that people were talking about was there was all this testimony that people were called up to talk about the job losses of the prison guards. And there were people that actually said and testified under oath in nearly tears that said, if the governor cared about people, he would figure out a way to fill the beds of prisons and he wouldn't be trying to close them. If he cared about families, he wouldn't be trying to close prisons, he'd be trying to open more. And it was because there was a fundamental lack for the humanity of the people that sat inside those prisons. And so when I spoke, I took a different approach because there were many people that were angry and I wanted to humanize the situation. And we had the governor, so we were gonna close the prison anyway. So I looked out at the prison guards and the people who were speaking and I said, I want to thank you for the time you spent caring for our loved ones who lived in our communities. And I represent the communities of many loved ones. We want to thank you for the time you spent caring for our loved ones, but they have families and it's time for them to return to their families. So we're going to begin to put in policies in place to reunite those people, because they are people that are in those cells, with their families, because they do have families that cared about them. Just like you talked about your families. And the governor's policies, when he's talking about families, he's thinking about all of the people inside of those prison walls, including the people that live there because they are inmates. And when he's putting in place policies to reduce them, he's thinking about reuniting those families. But he's also thinking about your families, because there should be a better life for you than spending 8 to 16 hours of your day, of each and every day of your life behind the wall, looking at other people in cages and being taught to act in an inhumane way towards those people. That is in fact sucking away a portion of your life and your own humanity. So yes, we need to find employment for you and all the folks who live and work in those small towns and prisons, but it needs to be you need to be engaged in a more humane, productive activity. And so I thanked them for caring for our loved ones, because I needed to emphasize the humanity of the people that they had custody over. And I did it for two reasons. One, I knew that some of those inmates were coming home, but many of them weren't. And I didn't want to and I also thought about my relatives who have been in those prisons, and I thought about would they want anyone to antagonize the guards, and then the next day the guards have to come back to them. And I thought about the lives of the people that were going to be impacted in that regard, in that way. And so I had to tailor my remarks, although I was angry with those folks, in a way that preserved and respected the quality of life that people behind the wall were going to have, and needed to tailor my remarks in a way that allowed them to understand the humanity of the people they had custody over, but also made it very clear and unequivocal that we were not going to advance policies that continue to support mass incarceration. And so we have to do two things. We have to, one, break down in the minds of people in the communities that we live in, this idea that somehow the only way we can be safe is if we lock lots of people up. That's the first thing. The second thing is we need to expose the financial connections between the mass incarceration and those communities, and therefore the financial incentives for legislators to vote for such policies, because shining a light on it is almost like a means of disinfectant. It may not completely get rid of it, but it begins to disinfect the process. And then finally, we need to put in place policies that empower people behind the wall and empower the families of those folks, so that we can begin to reverse this process. If we do those things and do it in a systemic way, we can do as we started doing in Pennsylvania, reduce the prison population. But we understand we need to be constantly vigilant about this. And so things like getting parole eligibility for lifers is important. And that's Senate Bill, we advanced with Senate Bill 942, House Bill 135. Those are things that'll be now Senate Bill 135 this session. Those are things we need to advance. We need to look at Senate Bill 16 that actually reduces the amount of time people have to stay in supervision, and the likelihood that people will be locked backup for technical parole and probation violations. Because there are too many people behind the wall, not even because they committed a crime, but because they had a technical probation and parole violation and were recommitted to facilities, because that leads to more mass incarceration. We need to examine the infractions that are given to people while they're behind the wall, so that people can go there with one amount of time, and then because of behind the wall infractions, without full due process, they're through basically a kangaroo court system, they're given more and more time, and that is something we need to examine. We need to examine the process through which we adjudicate people, and whether these judicial systems are fair, and what are the options that are given. We need to examine the limitations that are put on people when they get out of prison. You can't have this job, you can't work in this field, you can't go here. Many of these limitations aren't any way rationally related to the crimes that are prevented. Just because at one point in time I may have used an illegal substance, why should I never be able to work as a guard in a garage connected to a hospital because it's on hospital premises? Doesn't make rational sense. Just making it harder for people to get back on with their lives. You know, there are so many things, and I could go on for a while, but I know a lot of people have heard from a lot of folks. But we have to look at systemic change, and that's how we'll end mass incarceration. And we have to look at the financial incentives, the criminal justice incentives, the sentencing guidelines, the probation and parole system. And if we look at, and we have to look at the rehabilitative services that are inside of prisons, and then the reentry services that exist when people come home. If we can look at all of those things, and we can make a systemic change, then we can start reversing this tsunami that caused us this wave of mass incarceration that we have here. And we can start getting back to a more humane way of dealing with law enforcement. And in the process of doing it, I submit, not only will we be better, but we will in fact be safer as well. So I want to thank everybody for allowing me to share for a moment. I want you to continue to support all the pieces of legislation we have. And I'm gonna be quiet and answer questions if people have them of me, and if not, allow you to move on with the program in whatever way the hardworking organizers of this program see fit.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Street. You've given us a great deal to think about, as has everybody else this evening. We've kind of had a lot of information, a lot of voices, a lot of stories, a lot to think about. One of the things that we take away from this is there's a lot that's broken. Another thing we take away from this is there's a lot of things that are connected. And until we understand the connections, we can't even begin to change the things that are broken. Another thing that I take away from this is we have to be far more organized, far more aware, and connect with other groups in other ways. If you look at those states, as you heard several times tonight, there's 10 states that have enacted legislation to count incarcerated people in their home communities. Those were all done through broad coalitions, national groups, statewide groups, local groups, all figuring out how to share understanding, how to share stories, how to share information, how to share power in a way that reclaims real representation. That's part of what we're trying to do with these regional forums. I gave you a link to a survey.
There's one other thing I just want to share. The last thing I want to say is just, we got to eliminate the stigma that the only people who go to prison are people who are from bad families or bad. We have to eliminate the stigma, and part of that is us speaking out. That's what so many people are doing here. And I want you to know, first time I walked into a state correctional institution, it wasn't because I was an attorney paid to represent clients. It was because I was a family member visiting loved ones, just like many of you. And so every time I walk into that prison, I remember what it was like to walk into prison the first time, when I was just wanted to see my cousin who'd been like a brother to me. And he was locked behind the wall. And so I say that because as a senator, that we need to recognize that, look, all of us, no matter what walk of life we have, many of us have had loved ones who are locked up. And so the last part of it is everyone speaking out. We got to eliminate the stigma. There's only those people that somebody over there, they're not normal, good people that have relatives in prison. There's only bad people and bad families, and that's just not the case. And it wasn't the case for me. So I just wanted to share that as well. I'm sorry. Thank you. I yield.
Yeah, no, and thank you for saying that. And I'll say myself, I have two brothers who struggle with mental illness, both of whom have spent time in incarcerated, one who has spent time in solitary, which drove him to the absolute brink of disaster. And so that's in part why this matter is very personal to me. I've had two brothers, a niece and a nephew, spend significant time incarcerated. We have to be more organized. We have to be more informed. You've asked some good questions. We've had some really good people answering those questions. So every question that I've seen in chat has been answered well. Thank you, Rory and Bob and Elaine, for your sharing of information in chat. You did a phenomenal job. As I said, there's a survey. If you were to fill it out, I don't promise we'll get back to you immediately, but we are thinking through next steps, how to organize, how to continue to do more outreach, how to network better and stronger so that we can really change things. So I encourage you to fill that out and be thinking, we all have some superpowers. We all have some unexpected connections. We all have some unexpected abilities. We all have some unexpected experiences. And if we can figure out how to leverage those together, we can actually change things to have fair redistricting, partisan redistricting, fair, get rid of prison, get rid of gerrymandering in all its really toxic forms, have fair districts, and have real representation that allows us to have the kind of policies that let us all thrive. And we didn't even get into the huge economic cost of mass incarceration, but it's phenomenal when so much of our money is being spent holding people in prison long after they've served any reasonable time, long after they have any chance of being, redoing the crimes that they've done. When people have been there for 40 or 50 years, it's just silliness. And it's hugely expensive and it's hugely mean. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot more that we need to talk about, economic implications, ways to get out of this. Senator Street mapped out a lot of things that we need to pay attention to. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. We've spent more time than we planned this evening, so we really thank you for your patience. We will be sharing the link to the recording and more information with you in a follow-up email. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for your time. And thank you to all who spoke. It was just really moving to listen to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Take care. Good night.